The scorching sun beat down on the endless sands of the desert. Captain David Holt squinted into the horizon, shielding his eyes as his boots sank into the shifting dunes. The hum of his patrol vehicle echoed faintly behind him, a lone sound in the vast emptiness of the desert. Another quiet day, he muttered to himself. That's how it always was on the desert border, hot, silent, and uneventful. At least until today. Something unusual caught his eye up ahead, half buried in the sand. A shape, motionless and pale against the blazing gold of the desert. His brow furrowed, and a sense of unease stirred in his gut. No one survived out here for long without shelter. David jogged closer, his breath hitching as the figure came into view. His boots skidded to a stop, and he stared in disbelief. Lying in the sand was a woman, or at least something that looked like a woman. Her skin shimmered faintly blue under the harsh sunlight, an unearthly glow that set her apart. Long silver hair spilled around her like a shining river, and her faintly glowing markings traced elegant patterns across her arms and cheeks. David's heart pounded as he crouched next to her. What the hell? She was alive. Her chest rose and fell, though her breathing was shallow. She was clothed in nothing but tattered scraps of fabric that barely covered her, leaving her vulnerable to the sun's relentless heat. Sand clung to her skin, and faint burns marked her shoulders. "Hey," David said, his voice gentle but urgent. "Can you hear me?" There was no response. Up close, he noticed her ears, slightly pointed, inhuman, and the soft hum that seemed to radiate from her body. Whoever, or whatever she wasn't from Earth. David's instincts screamed at him to act. Questions could come later. Carefully, he scooped her into his arms. Her skin was warm, too warm, as though she'd been in the sun far too long. "You're gonna be okay," he muttered, as much to himself as to her. He carried her back toward the patrol vehicle, his mind racing. A million questions filled his head. Who was she? How did she end up here? Was she dangerous? But none of it mattered right now. She was alive, and she needed help. By the time he placed her in the shade of the vehicle, sweat poured down his face. He grabbed a canteen and gently pressed water to her lips. "Come on," he whispered. "Drink." The woman stirred slightly, her head turning toward him. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a brief moment, her glowing violet eyes flickered open. She looked at him, not with fear, but with exhaustion, and whispered something in a language he didn't understand. David froze. Her voice was soft, melodic, and utterly alien. "Don't worry," he said softly, trying to reassure her. "You're safe now. I'll get you somewhere cool." Her eyes closed again, and David leaned back, exhaling deeply. Whatever this was, it was far bigger than him. He glanced out over the endless desert, and then back at the strange, beautiful alien he had just rescued. "This just got complicated," he muttered, starting the engine. The patrol vehicle roared to life, leaving the empty sands behind. The hum of the engine was the only sound as Captain David Holt sped across the empty desert toward his outpost. The strange woman, or alien, rather, lay in the back seat, wrapped in a blanket he had hurriedly pulled from the vehicle's emergency supplies. Her silver hair glimmered faintly in the dim interior light, and her glowing skin pulsed with a faint, rhythmic hue. David's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where he could see her face. Who was she? Where did she come from? He shook his head. "This is insane." As if on cue, the alien woman stirred. Her fingers twitched beneath the blanket, and her breathing grew heavier. Suddenly, her glowing violet eyes shot open. David almost swerved the vehicle as he heard her gasp loudly. "Hey, whoa," he shouted, trying to keep the wheel steady. The alien sat upright, her movements sharp and panicked. Her glowing eyes darted around the unfamiliar surroundings. She pressed herself against the seat, her markings flashing erratically with colors David couldn't name. Pale pinks, sharp blues, and flashes of bright red. "It's okay," David said quickly, holding up one hand while steering with the other. "You're safe. Just calm down." The alien woman turned her sharp gaze on him, her lips parting as she spoke. Valor Eshka, Silvum Katari. Her voice was soft, but carried a strange musical quality. David blinked, his brows furrowing. Sorry. I don't speak that. She tilted her head, her glowing markings flickering lavender, a color that somehow seemed to represent confusion. She repeated her words, more forcefully this time. Valor Eshka, Katari. David exhaled, trying to calm himself. I don't understand you. But listen, I found you in the desert. You were unconscious, and I brought you here to help. Do you understand? Help. The alien stared at him for a long moment, her glowing eyes searching his face, as though trying to gauge whether he was lying. Then, as though exhausted by the effort, she slumped slightly, her markings dimming to a faint blue. David glanced at her in the mirror again. Good. At least you're not trying to blast me with laser beams or something. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she understood his tone, though she remained silent. Minutes later, they arrived at the outpost. David parked the vehicle and stepped out, moving around to open the door for her. Come on, he said gently. It's cooler inside. The alien hesitated but seemed to decide he wasn't a threat. Wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, she stepped out of the vehicle, her bare feet touching the hot sand. Her head turned slowly as she took in the outpost, an isolated building surrounded by endless desert. David watched her carefully. Even now, she moved with an unnatural grace, her glowing skin casting faint light around her. Let's get you inside, he said, gesturing toward the door. As they entered the outpost, the woman paused at the threshold, looking back at the desert one last time. Her eyes glimmered with something that looked almost like sadness. David noticed. Whoever left you out there, we'll figure it out. You're safe now. The alien turned to him, her markings pulsing faint lavender once again, and whispered something soft, almost like a sigh. Though David couldn't understand her words, the meaning in her eyes was clear. Gratitude. For the first time, David realized just how far this mystery might go. The outpost was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning unit. Captain David Holt paced the small room, his boots tapping lightly against the concrete floor. He glanced over at the alien woman, Princess Serena, though he didn't know her name yet, sitting quietly on the edge of the cot he had set up. Wrapped in a blanket, her silver hair spilled around her shoulders like liquid light. Her glowing skin had dimmed to a soft, steady blue, and her violet eyes followed him as he moved. There was still confusion in her gaze, but the fear had faded. Okay, David said, more to himself than to her. Let's start simple. He grabbed a water bottle from the counter and approached her slowly, holding it out. Here, water. Drink. The alien tilted her head, her glowing markings pulsing lavender, clearly her color for confusion. She stared at the bottle and then at him, unsure of what to do. David crouched down, unscrewing the cap to demonstrate. Look, water. He took a sip, then held it out again. This time, she seemed to understand. Hesitantly, she reached out, her slender fingers brushing against his hand as she took the bottle. She held it up to her lips and drank slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. There you go, David said softly. See, I'm not here to hurt you. She lowered the bottle and whispered something in her strange, melodic language. Kareth Valari. David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Still don't know what that means, but I'll take it as a thank you. The alien's lips curved faintly into what David swore was a smile. She studied him for a moment before pointing at him, her finger glowing faintly. Katan. David frowned. Of me? My name. He placed a hand on his chest. David. David, she repeated, her voice soft, testing the word. Her markings shifted to a gentle blue, and her expression seemed thoughtful. Encouraged, David gestured toward her. And you? What's your name? She blinked, as though surprised by the question. After a moment, she touched her chest lightly, her fingertips glowing brighter. Serena. David smiled. Serena, huh? That's a nice name. David, she said again, pointing at him, and then Serena, pointing at herself. David chuckled. Looks like we're getting somewhere. Suddenly, Serena's markings flared brighter, lavender and pink, colors David was beginning to associate with curiosity and uncertainty. She stood up, still clutching the blanket, and walked to the window. Through the glass, the desert stretched endlessly under the fading sunlight. She turned back to him, speaking softly but urgently. Valari, Kauteri, Saloon. David frowned, his smile fading. I still don't understand you, but you want answers, don't you? Serena's gaze held his, intense and filled with unspoken emotion. Whoever she was, and wherever she came from, she had been abandoned here, left alone in a world she didn't understand. David sighed deeply, his voice quiet but firm. Don't worry, Serena. We'll figure this out. You're not alone anymore. For the first time, Serena's markings dimmed to a calm, steady blue. She didn't understand his words, but something in his tone reassured her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, David knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary rescue. The mystery of Serena, and the danger she brought with her, was only just beginning. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp in the corner. Serena sat by the window, her violet eyes fixed on the vast desert under the night sky. The silence between her and David had grown comfortable, though neither fully understood the other. David leaned back in the creaky chair across the room, studying her carefully. Every now and then, her glowing markings would flicker, shifting from soft blue to lavender. A sign, he realized, that she was deep in thought. You're thinking about something, David said, even though he knew she couldn't fully understand him. Or someone. Serena turned her head, her silver hair cascading like a river of light. She studied him for a long moment before whispering softly, Valari, Kauteri Saloon. David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I wish I knew what that meant. He stood, moving over to the small table where his radio sat. He fiddled with the dials, but there was still no signal. Something about this region made communication unreliable. When he turned back to Serena, he noticed her markings had shifted, now glowing a faint red, a color he hadn't seen before. Her posture had stiffened, her eyes sharp as they darted toward the window. What's wrong? David asked, his instincts flaring. Serena stood suddenly, the blanket falling to the floor. She rushed to the window, placing a hand on the glass, her markings pulsing brighter. She whispered something urgent. Kareth, Kauteri. David's stomach tightened. He couldn't understand the words, but her tone said it all. Danger was near. He grabbed his rifle from the nearby wall, checking the safety. Hey, calm down, Serena. What's out there? Serena turned back to him, her glowing eyes filled with something between fear and determination. Slowly, she raised her arm and pointed toward the desert beyond the window. David's heart sank as he followed her gaze. Out there, in the moonlit sands, shadows moved, too many to count. Figures appeared on the dunes, sleek and unnatural, their outlines just visible against the night sky. What the hell? David muttered, his grip on the rifle tightening. Serena stepped closer to him, her glowing markings flashing a mix of red and lavender. She pointed to herself, then to the figures outside. Valari, Kauteri, Zareth. David looked at her, realization dawning on him. They're looking for you, aren't they? Those things, whatever they are, they're after you. Serena nodded sharply, her glowing skin now reflecting urgency. David cursed under his breath, turning to check the doors and windows. Great, just great. I save an alien princess, and now I've got her enemies showing up at my doorstep. Serena moved to his side, her expression serious. She spoke softly, placing a hand on his arm. David, Valari, Zareth, danger. David paused, his gaze meeting hers. He didn't know exactly what she was saying, but he didn't need a translator to understand her meaning. Whoever these pursuers were, they weren't here to talk. He glanced back at the rifle, and then at her glowing face. "Don't worry, Serena. If they want to fight, they'll get one." Outside, the figures in the desert crept closer, their intentions clear. Inside the outpost, David prepared for what was coming. The battle between desire and heroism had begun. David crouched near the window, his rifle at the ready. Through the faint moonlight, he could see them, dark, shadowy figures moving closer across the sand. Their movements were unnatural, smooth yet predatory, as if they were gliding toward the outpost. Serena stood beside him, her glowing markings now a deep crimson, signaling fear and urgency. She clutched the edge of his shirt, her soft voice trembling. "Zareth, danger." David looked at her, his expression firm but calm. "Yeah, I figured as much. Those friends of yours don't look like they're here to talk." Serena's glowing violet eyes met his, desperate and pleading. She pointed to herself, then out the window. "Valari, Zareth, me." "You mean they're after you specifically," David muttered, his brows furrowing. He let out a frustrated sigh, shaking his head. "I don't know why, Serena, but you're clearly important to them." Serena stepped closer, gripping his arm tightly. "David, leave. Safe." David turned to face her, surprised. "What? You're telling me to leave you? Are you crazy?" Serena nodded insistently, her voice soft but resolute. "Me? Zareth. You? Safe." David stared at her for a moment, realization settling in. She wanted him to run, to save himself, but something deep in his gut refused to accept that. "No way. I don't care if you're an alien princess or just some lost traveler. I'm not leaving you behind." Serena blinked, her glowing markings flickering from crimson to faint lavender, confusion mixed with something new. "Trust." David stood, checking his rifle and tightening his grip. "If they want you, they'll have to go through me first." The sound of something metallic scraping against the walls of the outpost sent a chill through the room. David turned sharply, heart pounding as the first shadowy figure approached the door. It hissed softly, a guttural sound that made his skin crawl. "Here we go," David muttered, positioning himself near the door. "Serena, stay back." Serena moved toward the center of the room, her glowing body now pulsing like a heartbeat. Her markings flashed brighter, and her silver hair seemed to ripple as an unseen energy surrounded her. She whispered something in her language, soft and rhythmic, like a chant. The door rattled once, twice. Then, with a sudden bang, it burst open, and the shadowed intruders rushed in. Their forms were humanoid but twisted, cloaked in darkness and shifting shapes. Their glowing red eyes locked on Serena, their intent clear. David didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The sharp cracks of gunfire echoed through the outpost, and the first figure collapsed, its form dissolving into mist. "Not today," David growled, moving to cover Serena. Serena's voice rose, her markings glowing brighter with every second. The air around her vibrated with energy as if she was gathering her strength. The intruders hesitated, as though sensing something was changing. Serena stepped forward, her glowing eyes locked on them. A pulse of bright blue light shot outward from her body, shaking the entire outpost. David shielded his eyes, the force pushing him back. When he looked up, the shadows were retreating, their figures dissolving into the desert winds. Serena turned to him, her voice calm but firm. "Danger not gone. More come." David pushed himself to his feet, his chest heaving. "Then we'll be ready. You're not alone in this, Serena." She stared at him, her markings shifting to a soft, trusting blue. For the first time, she whispered in near-perfect English, "Thank you, David." David gave her a small, confident smile. Outside, the desert was silent again, but both of them knew the danger wasn't over. "Whatever happens next," David said, reloading his rifle, We face it together. The silence after the attack was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the wind outside. David leaned against the wall, wiping sweat from his forehead. His rifle rested at his side, but his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the broken door. For now, the shadows were gone. Serena sat on the floor, her glowing markings dimming to a pale blue. Her silver hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and her breathing was steady again. She looked up at David, her violet eyes calm but filled with unspoken thoughts. David crouched down next to her, exhaling. "All right, Serena. I need answers. Who are you, and why are those things after you?" Serena tilted her head slightly, processing his words. Her glowing markings pulsed faint lavender, a sign David now understood as her trying to find the right way to respond. Finally, she touched her chest gently and spoke in her soft, melodic voice. "Serena, Valare, Princess." David blinked. "Princess, your royalty." Serena nodded slowly, her gaze shifting toward the broken doorway. "Zareth, my people, my enemy. They want me." David's stomach dropped as he pieced it together. "You're telling me you're some kind of alien princess, and those things, the Zareth, or whatever, they're hunting you." She gave a faint nod, her markings now flickering red with tension. "Zareth, war, power. I escape. They leave me here. Desert." David's jaw clenched. "So they dumped you here to die, and now they're coming to take you back." Serena lowered her gaze, her glowing skin dimming as though ashamed. "Yes, I fail. I alone." David frowned, his frustration growing, not with her, but with the situation. He stood, pacing back and forth. "So let me get this straight. You're not just lost. You're a target. And those shadows out there aren't stopping until they get you." Serena looked up at him, her markings softening to blue. "I go. You. Safe." David froze mid-step, turning to face her. "What did you say?" Serena stood slowly, clutching her hands together. "I go. Alone. You, no fight. No danger. Safe." David stared at her, disbelief in his eyes. "You think I'm going to just let you walk out there and hand yourself over to those things?" She looked confused, as if his refusal didn't make sense. "Why? Not your war." David stepped forward, his voice firm. "Because I don't abandon people, Serena. I don't care if you're human, alien, or a glowing princess from space. You're not alone anymore." Her markings flashed brighter, her glowing skin pulsing faintly with a mixture of blue and lavender. Trust and surprise. "You fight for me." David nodded, determination etched into his face. "Dan right, I will. We'll figure this out together. You said those things want power. Then let's make sure they don't get you." Serena's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "David, strong." David smirked. "Yeah, well, let's hope I'm strong enough." Outside, the wind howled as the desert prepared for what was coming. David knew the Zareth wouldn't stop until they had Serena. But as he looked at her glowing, determined face, he also knew one thing for sure. They were about to get the fight of their lives. The night was silent, but David knew it wouldn't last. The Zareth were coming, shadows in the dark, relentless, and hungry for their prize. The desert wind whispered across the broken door of the outpost, carrying the promise of battle. David stood by the window, loading his rifle with calm determination. The faint hum of the incoming threat gnawed at the edge of his senses. He glanced at Serena, who sat cross-legged on the floor. Her glowing markings pulsed a steady blue, her silver hair catching the dim light as she prepared herself. "You don't have to do this," David said, breaking the silence. "I can hold them off. You can escape." Serena shook her head, rising to her feet. Her markings flared brighter, glowing with renewed resolve. "No, David. I stay. I fight." David gave her a small, proud smile. "Good, because we're not giving up that easily." Outside, the darkness rippled as the Zereth approached, their red eyes glowing like embers in the night. Their numbers had doubled. They moved like shadows, slipping through the dunes, as though the desert belonged to them. David tightened his grip on the rifle. "All right, Serena. I'll draw their fire. If you've got some alien magic up your sleeve, now's the time to use it." Serena stepped closer to him, her voice soft but firm. "Together, not alone." David nodded, his chest swelling with a strange sense of pride. "Together, then." The first Zereth appeared at the doorway, its red eyes locking onto Serena. It hissed, the sound crawling across David's skin like ice. Without hesitation, David fired. The rifle's sharp crack shattered the silence, and the Zereth staggered back, dissolving into mist. But more came. "Stay close," David shouted as he moved through the outpost, firing at the advancing shadows. The Zereth swarmed like smoke, slipping through cracks and corners. For every one he struck down, two more replaced it. Serena stood at the center of the room, her markings flaring brighter and brighter until they glowed like a star. Her voice rose in her native language, a soft, rhythmic chant that grew louder with each word. David fired another shot, then turned to look at her. "Serena, whatever you're doing, do it fast." Serena's body pulsed with energy. She raised her arms, her glowing skin shining brighter than the moon outside. The Zereth paused, sensing the shift, their movements faltering as the air vibrated around them. "Zereth, no more," Serena cried, her voice echoing with power. A massive pulse of energy erupted from her body, sweeping through the outpost like a wave of light. The Zereth hissed in unison, their dark forms unraveling into mist and scattering into the desert winds. When the light faded, silence returned. The outpost was still. David lowered his rifle slowly, blinking at the empty desert. "They're gone," he breathed. Serena swayed slightly, exhaustion written across her glowing face. David rushed to her side, steadying her. "Hey, you okay?" She looked up at him, her markings now a faint, peaceful blue. "Safe. You save me." David grinned, shaking his head. "You saved yourself, Serena. I just helped." Serena smiled faintly, her eyes glowing with trust. "David, hero." David chuckled, glancing back at the empty desert. "I'm just a guy trying to do the right thing. But you're not alone anymore, princess. You've got me now." The two of them stood together, side by side, as the first rays of dawn broke over the dunes. The desert was quiet again, but it was no longer empty. For Serena, Earth was no longer a place of abandonment. It was a place of hope. And for David, he had discovered what true heroism meant, standing for someone when no one else would. Together, they had faced the impossible. Together, they had won.